Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. So today we're going to talk about the first part of Warbreaker. So in this reread slash read along, we're going to break it down into three different parts. We're going to cover maybe about 20 chapters or so each part. And the way the graphic audiobook actually breaks it down kind of works in a three-act structure, kind of a lot like a movie. So I want to kind of talk about it from that perspective. So this, of course, will only have spoilers for the first part of Warbreaker. So if you haven't read it, then I recommend you do and jump along with us and join in this in the discussion. And for purposes of the discussion, if you have already read the entire book, please limit your responses and your opinions and stuff to just what you thought about this first part of the story. So that way we can kind of speculate and discuss what we think would happen or have happened had certain things turned out differently. So yeah, as always, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and let's begin. So, Warbreaker. This is one of the books that was originally a standalone, but I do believe Nightblood is going to be a official sequel. So I guess it won't be a standalone anymore. But this story is really interesting. It takes place on the planet of Nalthvis. It is a interesting peek into the different aspects of the Cosmere. We get a planet that is basically governed, well, that is invested by a different shard than the other ones that we've seen. So it's an interesting change of setting. It's a change of pace in the way everything works together. So it's a lot of fun to explore. So when we get into the story, we're immediately introduced to the Idrians. They are a very conservative, very reserved people who had at one time ruled the entire kingdom of this region that they're in. But due to some war and some change-ups and like people taking over other thrones, they were basically shunted into the highlands, where they still maintain their royal family, but they are no longer rulers of the entire area over which they previously ruled. So this entire first part really works as a intro. We get an introduction to all the main players, all the main characters, and to the main story arc that is like going to be explored in this book. And we kind of get an introduction to the inciting incident that leads to everything else that happens. So we're introduced to the Idrians, and we're introduced to the Idrian royal family, and we are introduced to the king, who immediately, basically, our first interaction with him is him saying that he doesn't have favorites, but he clearly does have favorites amongst his daughters, because to hold off a war with the Halandrans, they have to basically give their daughter up in order to maintain the treaty that they have. So their daughter will marry into that family, basically legitimizing their throne and giving them less power, which basically is only a slow down method that will stop them from attacking them and causing full-on war and destroying them utterly. So the king has three daughters, and one of them was specifically chosen to be the one that was going to be married off to the God King. But he has, over the time, because of her training, her steadfastness, and her love of the Idrian ways and everything, she has been proven to basically probably work as a better overall monarch successor. So basically, he tries to say it's because it's for the greater, it's for Idris and everything. But in reality, it's because she has become his favorite daughter, and he doesn't want to send her away to what is essentially death. That is his perception. And so instead of sending her, he sends the youngest daughter, or fourth. He has four daughters, I believe. So the fourth one, he sends, who is basically ancillary, who is like doesn't have extra, doesn't have a prescribed purpose in life. Basically sends her instead, and basically says it would be less painful to lose her than it would be to lose the other daughter, which is kind of terrible. But that's kind of how we get in the situation where we are. So that was basically our introduction to kind of the royal family and the stakes of the situation, and to the king. And then later we kind of switch over to Ciri. She is the girl, she is the extra daughter, she is the one that has no prescribed purpose in life and stuff, and she's the one that's going to be sent. So we kind of get from her perspective like how she loves to frolic and basically be free and like cause tantrums and stuff to be a bother for people and stuff. Basically, she doesn't really have any major responsibility, so she's kind of free and she just gets to kind of like slack off and all this kind of stuff. But when she finds out she's going to be sent, she's just, her mind is completely blown. She doesn't understand why and stuff. And like, obviously, she wouldn't understand why because she thought her other sister, Vivenna, this was her purpose and everything. So we kind of get in her head for the entirety of that situation in which she's sent over. And it's just like, from her perspective, it's so terrifying. And it's really interesting to see like the differences between who they thought they were going to get and like who they actually got. So we're basically promised a lot of interesting kind of shakeups and stuff just by the fact that she doesn't have all the training that her sister Vivenna had in preparation for this event. So we already know it's just not going to go well. So that was our quick introduction to the Idrian royal family and like the whole dynamic of the situation that's going on. So at that point, I immediately didn't like the king. I was like, dude, you're totally playing favorites. Like, this really, really sucks. Like, I understand like the whole situation is like they're basically between a rock and a hard place. Basically, the war is inevitable and they cannot win. And basically, their only options are to delay as much as possible. So they can just hope that they delay them at least until the winter so they can use the cold and the snow and everything as, you know, some sort of help to give them just any little bit of advantage possible. So the tactic of sending the other daughter, they figured it would either confuse them, causing them to delay even more, or it would piss them off enough where they would just say skip it and go ahead and attack immediately. But luckily for them, it does cause a kind of a delay thing because they, you know, they're curious as to what it really means for them to send the younger daughter instead of the older daughter. And at this point, I was really interested in Ciri. I thought she was really fun. She reminded me immediately a lot of Merida from the Pixar or Disney Pixar movie Brave. She reminded me a lot of her a lot. Like this, so that was the image I immediately had in my head. Especially since in the graphic audio version they have very specific like Scottish accents, and like it just all worked in my head really easily. Especially with the whole royal locks and stuff, and hers were red a lot of the time. It was like either blonde and like or to be red when. It has an interesting introduction with that as well, the royal locks. That's a really cool thing that we get introduced to that I almost always forget about. But she kind of reminded me of Merida, so I kind of already had this kind of level of impression of the character, so I was really interested to see what we were going to do. So my first impression of Ciri was she's basically Merida from Brave, and she's definitely going to go down to Halandren and jump into this situation because of her level of ignorance. It kind of works as a shield and an excuse for her to change things and like shake stuff up. So I just thought she was going to just kind of be like a culture shock and show them that the Idrians are really cool and stuff. So that's my initial impression, that she's going to go in there and just kind of, you know, like one of those classic movies or whatever where the fish out of water scenario happens, but then the new fish comes in and like changes stuff for the better. So I just kind of had like a lot of those optimistic feels for it immediately. Let me know definitely in the comments what your initial impressions were. How did you think it was going to go? Did you think like they were immediately going to kill Ciri or something, or like how did you figure it was going to pan out? Let me know about that. So after we get introduced to the Idrian royal family, we jump over to Halandren and we get introduced to the characters that are primary characters over there. So we're introduced to that side of everything through the perspective of one of the gods. In this world, you can die and you will be brought back to life by the god of the world, and you will be turned into what is called a returned, which means that you are basically immortal if you subsist on the breath of another person. And a breath is basically the colloquial term for a bit of the magic that exists in this world. So everyone has a breath, which is not necessarily their soul, but culturally a lot of people do believe it is their soul. So multiple people in the world, if you have multiple breaths, if you have multiple ones of these little bits of power, then you can awaken objects. So that's the entire magic system that's been introduced, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in detail after I talk about the Council of Gods. We'll talk a little bit more about the magic system after I talk about the Council of Gods. So we're introduced to Lightsong. He is one of the gods. He is one of these returned, and he is basically treated as a god, even though he himself doesn't believe in his own divinity. So we're introduced to the political structure of the way Halandren works through his perspective, from this interesting, cool, cynical perspective. He's a really cool character, and you immediately kind of get to know him a little bit and like him a lot. At least I did. My immediate impression was this guy is cool. Like, he's going to tell you how it is, and he's a jokester. He's very sarcastic, and he's glib, and it's just a lot of fun character attributes that you know, it makes it a lot of fun reading about this kind of character. and we're introduced to some of the other gods that are around him, and like just the structure of the way everything works by way of going through like a typical day in the life for him. Like these gods have to basically, they're pampered all day, all the time. They never leave the big palace and stuff, and they go and like interpret paintings and stuff, which people believe are glimpses into the future, because technically they do glimpse into the future and stuff. So there's a lot of that in there. But yeah, essentially we go through all of his responsibilities of the day. He has to basically contend with his worshippers and stuff like that. So it's a really interesting setup, and it's a really interesting glimpse into the world that exists. And we kind of get a little bit of a glimpse of the idea of the God King, because even the lower gods on the Council of Gods, they don't really interact with the God King. No one really interacts with the God King. So we still, even at this point, don't know pretty much anything about the man that Ciri is now betrothed to marry. So we just continue to have this mystery that's building up, and I like that part about it a lot. I thought the entire structure of the Council of Gods and stuff, I thought that was a really cool add-in. It's a really interesting bit of world building, on top of the fact that we're in this world that is very much unlike other worlds in the Cosmere that we've experienced so far, and that is basically a giant jungle. Well, I guess you could say Patchy, the one of the short stories, kind of has a biome similar to this. But to have a kingdom and like a feudal system and stuff inside a world that's basically like a jungle and like a, you know, just really tropical and stuff like that, I think that's really cool. And it's a really interesting aesthetic. And almost immediately, I got the impression from Lightsong is that he was going to be one of Brandon's typical, like, reluctant heroes kind of character. Like, he's, you know, he doesn't believe in his own divinity and stuff. So I was like, okay, so he's definitely going to be one to do something the most divine of all these characters and, like, really earn his place as a god and stuff. So I was just really interested in that. And, like, it gives off so much promise. So it sets up the entire scenario, and we basically end it with. So, another character that we're introduced to in this beginning part, another character that's running around in the background, is Vasher. Vasher is someone that we know very little about, but he is running around doing really cool stuff. The story actually opens up with him, where he is in a prison, and he basically escapes from the prison. And he has this sword that turns out to be an amazingly interesting sword. It can speak in his mind, and it corrupts people to the point where anyone that tries to steal the sword will ultimately die in probably a couple of minutes. It's a really interesting kind of mysterious setup for this character. We don't know much about him. We don't know pretty much anything about this sword. We don't know anything about his plans. We just know he's running around in the background doing all kinds of stuff. And another character that was introduced or given more detail is Vivenna, the older sister of Ciri, who was passed over and being sent to the God King. So after Ciri is sent off to Halandra, and she basically goes through this depressing situation where like she feels like her purpose in life was taken away from her, and she kind of convinces herself that Ciri is in grave danger and that they're basically going to use her as a puppet and like pump out children, then kill her and stuff. And she just kind of wanted to protect her sister. Really, it was her being selfish and a little arrogant and like wanting to take back her position that, you know, she believed that was hers destiny, you know, is her birthright and everything. So she kind of rationalizes it in this way that she needs to go and protect her sister. So she escapes and goes off to Halandran to try to get her to come back. So leaving the king without two of his daughters and without the one that he wanted to become the new queen. And it kind of messes his head up a little bit. But she ends up finding a rude awakening when she gets there. Everything about the situation, she's just completely unprepared for. And I thought it was kind of well played that she thought she was so well prepared, she was so overconfident that she was going to be able to go and deal with this. But when she gets there, the reality is so much different than the fantasy and all that. So she just kind of goes through pretty much a lot of stuff, almost immediately pretty much not knowing what to do. But luckily she's helped by the mercenaries that the previous spy master from her country employed. So they kind of are helping her out, giving her the ropes and stuff, and trying to basically cobble together a bit of a plan that'll help Idris in any way with the upcoming war. So let's wrap up this first part with the thing that I consider to be basically the inciting incident for the rest of the story. So at this point, Siri is at the court of, I keep wanting to say court of owls for some reason. At this point, Siri is at the court of gods, the council of gods and stuff, and she's with the god king and everything. She's been put through these rituals that basically are like mating rituals or whatever, and she goes through all the decorum and everything, where she has to go into the room naked and like kneel on the ground and stuff, wait for the god king to come to her so they can consummate. And she waits there like all night to the point of falling asleep in this position, and the god king never touches her, and it like happens again and again, and where she basically kind of gets fed up and gets on the bed because she wants to sleep on the bed instead of on the ground because he's not touching her or anything. And their interaction kind of takes off, and it's like she kind of realizes like, okay, he's not what I thought, like everything about this is not quite what I thought it was. But the first part of the book, that at least the first part we're going to stop at, basically ends with her discovering that the God King's tongue has been cut out and he can't speak or read or anything like that. So she kind of makes this connection that there is basically a conspiracy going on, that the priest and everything, they don't want him to be able to talk or something like that, or use the amount of breaths that he has because he's so incredibly powerful. So it kind of just sets up this thing where this girl from outside, they were afraid that if she got too close to him, she would learn stuff and she would end up messing up their entire situation. And she basically, in her head, commits to doing exactly that. So we basically have the thing that triggers the entire, I guess, primary plot of the story. At least that's how I feel about it. But we have our secondary plot that has also been kind of triggered here too, with the Council of Gods. There's Blushweaver and a few other gods that we don't get a lot of interaction with, but she is working with them in order to try to get all the commands for the lifeless, because they are able to take control of this army of reanimated corpses that is basically their soldiers. So the actual people and stuff don't have to fight. So if they take control of all those lifeless, then they can basically start the war whenever they want to start it. And it's kind of a intrigue, an infighting thing, and a power grab and stuff. And it's an interesting behind the scenes kind of extra plot line. It's a really good B plot. But before I wrap up, I want to talk a little bit about Awakening. I already talked about it before, but so the idea of Awakening is that the breath that everyone has initially, if you add more onto it, you can then use those breaths to awaken inanimate objects. And the way to do that is to make a command that is very clear and very understandable in your native language to a object that looks something like a human, but isn't necessarily like a human. The closer it is to the human form, the easier it is to actually awaken it. And through the use of a breath or multiple breaths and color, you can imbue an object with a command and it'll do what you want it to do. Like in the story, we see Kelsier commands a straw person that he kind of creates, this like a straw doll that looks like a bit of a person. He commands it with a breath to go and grab the key so that he can get out of his cell. And he also like leeches color from, I believe, a stone or something like that in order to fuel the magic. So it's a really interesting magic system, one that I haven't seen before. A magic system fueled by color, I think, is really, really cool, and it's very unique. And the way that it kind of expands and expands, and the more we learn about it, the more interesting it gets, and the way the number of breaths you have kind of manipulate the passive abilities you have, like a life sense or agelessness or like freedom from disease and all that kind of stuff. It's really interesting and it's really unique, and we got a really interesting introduction to it here, but we only get a little bit, mostly through Vasher's actions, and we don't really understand what he's doing, but we're getting a lot of interesting hints. So a lot of that's going to be explained in later parts of the book. So I can't wait to get into that stuff. So, before we wrap up, I want to ask 3 main questions so that we can kind of use that as a springboard for the conversation about this first part. So, how do you feel Brandon did with this first part of the story? Does it work as a good opening first act for you? For me, it feels very much like a very expanded opening first act of a movie, where we get all the introduction and all the inciting incident, introduction to the plot and the issue and stuff that we're facing. I think it worked out really well. Let me know if you agree with that in the comments down below. So at this point in the story, how did you feel about the swap? About the king swapping Vivenna for Ciri? Like, did you really think it was because Vivenna would make a better monarch and better for Idris as a country and stuff? Or was it just clear playing out favoritism? I already mentioned previously that I think it was favoritism. It comes off as just straight up favoritism. He thought the extra daughter that was a little bit annoying and that doesn't really do a whole lot of stuff, she was very expendable. So he sent her. That's how I saw it. Let me know if you agree with that or if you didn't in the comments. Let's talk about it. And finally, was the God King build up successful for you? Were you like anxious and stuff about him like I was? Did he kind of scare you a little bit? The idea of this aloof, like very, I kind of got the impression that like the way no one could talk to him and stuff, and the way she couldn't touch him and all this kind of stuff, it just came off the way that they were trying to make it come off as like that he was someone so quick to anger that he'll kill you at any moment just cuz, like on a whim, like just so fleeting with his power and stuff like that. So I was just kind of already intimidated by it and stuff, so I wasn't sure what to expect. So let me know if that kind of introduction and that kind of build up for the character worked for you. Let me know about that in the comments down below. So we're going to definitely cover part 2 of it probably next week. So yeah, make sure you are subscribed to catch that. And make sure you leave a comment down there. So subscribe to the channel as always. And I will talk to y'all next time. Peace.